Okay, so okay, the break to uh, hi, comrades. Hi, comrades, and welcome today. I have the honor of chairing the first session of the confirmation of the Workers International Network. For comrades who don't know me, I am Mahindra from Mumbai. Together with my comrade Lakshman, I have attended every single meeting of WIN for the last 3 years. We have learned so much from listening to you, comrades, from all around the world. We have comrades in many parts of India, and we are determined to build win. The working class is fighting every day against the Modi government. We have had strikes of 300 million workers, the farmers' siege of the capital city, and now the birth of a new mass party of unemployed youth. This conference will be held online over several weeks. Today, we are opening a discussion on our new document on world perspective, the new world order. Comrade Roger will give a general introduction. Comrade Matthew will speak on the war in the Middle East, and the meeting will then be open for your contribution. आवाज नहीं आ रही.
Roger, you're
I'm
muted.
Roger, you're muted. Cannot hear you.
Roger, you
Is
need
it all
to
right?
mute yourself. Roger, we can't
Roger,
hear
you're
you.
muted. We can't hear you, Roger.
Okay, apologies, comrade. It's my fault. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, apologies, comrades. If we look at the world today, the scenario is in some respects uncannily similar to almost 100 years ago. The 1920s and the 1930s were really just a pause in what was a kind of prolonged 30 years war from 1914 to 1945. These so-called interwar years saw the downfall of four of the five ruling dynasties of Europe. They were the scene of first a feverish boom and then a catastrophic crash, a succession of revolutions, counter-revolutions, wars, civil wars, invasions, occupations, and coups. In Europe, the first fascist dictatorships in Italy and Portugal, then the Nazi regime in Germany, the annexation of Austria, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the civil war in Spain, in Russia, the monstrous deformation of the revolution, in Africa, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, in Asia, the Japanese invasion of China, and all of this at a time of so-called peace. These were just a prelude to the bloodiest war in human history, bringing with it the nightmares of Auschwitz, Hiroshima, the gulags, and the Holocaust. and is today so very different. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian and Russian soldiers have died in the Ukraine war, now entering its fifth year. Civil wars are raging in Yemen, Congo, Sudan, Myanmar. Outright genocide is perpetrated in front of our eyes in Gaza, and a killing spree on the West Bank and in Lebanon, with governments around the world colluding in it and jailing, deporting, and branding as terrorists those who protest against it. This is a stark warning of the methods they're already consciously preparing to deploy against future risings of the oppressed worldwide. An American president calmly threatens to wipe out an entire civilization, to bomb Iran into the Stone Age. Governments are spending billions on new armaments, actually currently nearly $3 trillion. They're preparing to introduce conscription for the young and openly preparing for an imminent Third World War. And meanwhile, a dark cloud is descending from the USA to India and throughout Europe. The liberal mask is being discarded. Far-right parties are sweeping the world. They're already in or closing in on governments from traditionally social democratic Scandinavia to Italy, which was not so long ago home of the biggest communist party in Europe. In Portugal, they're winning 18%. In Germany, 21%. In Britain, 26%. In Austria, 29%. In France, 37%. In London and cities throughout Europe, fascist mobs are strutting the streets. The ruling class has shed the democratic face it has worn since the last World War, and in gearing itself up for the next, it has stripped bare its true nature. The population of Gaza are only the first to suffer the consequences. We've all been warned. Now, all these shocks are violent manifestations of changes in world relations. In 1960, the US economy was as big as all the next 8 countries put together, but its nuclear-armed rival, the USSR, was in second place. By 1991, the USSR had collapsed, thus wiping out whatever was left of the last remaining gains of the revolution of October 1917. For a period, the USA found itself on top, without any economic or military rivals. The collapse of the USSR had come as a complete shock to Western diplomats and commentators. As comrades will remember, it was celebrated by one of its rising academic stars as the end of history. I think we'd all agree that that was slightly premature. But the USA did enjoy a brief spell of uncontested global domination. It wasn't long, though, before the USA was coming under challenge from China, with its combination of state planning and a vast untapped supply of cheap labor, to a lesser extent also from a resurgent Russia, with its vast oil reserves and the formidable military power it had accumulated during the Cold War. Now the old division of the world has been blown apart by the downfall of Stalinism, the effects of globalization, the deliberately fostered deindustrialization of the USA and most of Western Europe, the meteoric growth of the Chinese economy, the development of the BRICS nations, etc. So, like that of the British Empire before it, today the old supremacy of the American Empire is crumbling. Between 1945 and 1973, the USA had been growing by an annual average of 4%. Since then, it's hardly reached 2%. Over the past 15 years, the average growth rate of the US economy has slumped by nearly half, in other words, compared to the previous 25 years. American companies are currently burdened with the heaviest debts in their history, with the total outstanding debt amounting to 5 times their annual income. Over the last 2 years, corporate bankruptcies in the USA have soared by 87%. And by the way, the decline of Europe is even more precipitous. Europe's share of global economic output fell from roughly 33% in 2005 to 23% in 2024. And according to the Madison Project, which is a database at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands that tracks economic history, this is actually, that is the Europe's share of global economic output is now the lowest level for the continent since the Middle Ages. The IMF lists the gross domestic product of the top 5 countries in this order: USA, China, Germany, Japan, India. However, taking into account purchasing power parity, which is considered by some a truer measure of an economy's real size, the World Bank has compiled a very different ranking order, putting China at number 1, followed by the USA, India, Russia, and Japan. Incidentally, by either measure, Asian countries constitute 3 out of the top 5 economies. The Chinese economy is now, of course, by far the world's largest manufacturing power, at least 2.5 times the size of the US economy by value of manufactured output. China now dominates several sectors: solar and wind power, electric vehicles, and the core resources required for developing technologies such as rare earth metals, lithium, and other key minerals. Now, when the supremacy of one empire is challenged by a new rising power, it usually means war. In fact, the only exception I can think of is the supplanting of British supremacy by the USA, which happened by the USA watching British power crumble in 2 world wars with Germany before then stepping in late in order to garner the spoils. Now, as I say, empires rarely cede supremacy to a rising adversary without a last-ditch fight, and the USA is gearing itself up for a future conflict with China. And one key element in its preparations is the need somehow to neutralize the potential military threat posed by China's current ally, Russia, with its huge nuclear arsenal. The strategy of the traditional faction of the US ruling class, represented mainly by the Democrats, have been to seek, at colossal cost and with diminishing returns, to exhaust Russia's military, diplomatic, and economic resources with economic sanctions and a military encirclement of Russia by NATO. The new administration is supplanting this policy with an alternative strategy: to neutralize Russia rather than confront and provoke it. And Trump's Secretary of War has actually recently spelt it out very brutally. He said, "We can forget about Europe. The enemy is China." So the relative stability of the old post-war epoch has given way to chaos and turmoil. In 2007 to 8, the system imploded. On the point of collapse, the economy was temporarily propped up by the state bailing out the banks. The cost was imposed on the working class in the form of vast state debts, and the consequent fall in living standards for most of the world's population precipitated a chain reaction of turbulence worldwide, an upsurge of protests, uprisings, and governmental crises, bringing with them the collapse of the old reformist parties and the sudden eruptions of new left movements: Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, the Corbyn phenomenon in Britain, Sanders in the USA, etc. All of them soon themselves to end in utter capitulation and an abysmal collapse. I want to take just one example. Greece is the prime example. There were years of mounting protests leading to the growth and election from nowhere of the new left party, Syriza. And lacking any strategy to combat the stranglehold of the banks, within months, the government held a referendum, desperately hoping that the electorate would give it a mandate and an excuse to capitulate. So when the question was put to the masses, do we submit or do we fight? 2/3 of the population of Greece and a majority in practically every conceivable demographic sector voted a resounding no to the demands of the world's bankers. It was an absolutely overwhelming, crushing mandate to defy the capitalists. And what happened? The very next day, the Greek Prime Minister Tsipras, the left socialist, swept into power by a surge of protest and defiance, miserably capitulated, plunging the population into a complete catastrophe. Tsipras, that very day, openly confessed to his fellow minister Varoufakis that his reason for capitulating was that he was afraid, alternatively, of facing a firing squad. In other words, it was an absolutely overt and self-confessed act of treachery and cowardice. And I would say, by the way, similarly, those who naively placed their hopes in a Burnham government in Britain, restoring somehow to the Labour Party some of its former authority as a party of the working class, have, in my opinion, completely failed to understand what is happening. The collapse in support for the Labour Party is not an accidental or a local phenomenon. It is matched by the breakdown of the old failed social democracy worldwide. The French Socialist Party, the German SPD, the Social Democrats of Sweden, Denmark, Austria, and all the rest, even of Congress in India. Blair and New Labour did manage to enact at least superficial and cosmetic reforms, and then Blair left the scene just in time before the crash. Reformism has no role today because under capitalism today, there is simply no room for reforms. On the contrary, it's hell-bent on clawing back from the working class whatever concessions it had gained in the past. Moreover, its former social base, its bedrock of support in the traditional industrial communities, is gone forever. Reformism has neither the space in which to operate nor the foundation upon which to rest. And that explains the mass despair which lies behind the rise of far-right populist parties, East and West. Now, society has, of course, become polarized as never before. The world's super rich have enjoyed a colossal rise in their wealth. In 2011, 400 people had owned more wealth than the bottom half of the whole American population. But by 2019, this had shrunk to just 3. In the year 2000, the combined wealth of the world's billionaires had amounted to just $1 trillion. Since then, it has swelled to $16.1 trillion in 2025. Within the 5 years 2020 to 25, the years of the pandemic, the Ukraine war, the Gaza genocide, during that entire period of mass suffering throughout the world, the collective wealth of the billionaires grew by 81%. That is $8.2 trillion to $18.3 trillion. And according to Oxfam, that is enough to eradicate global poverty 26 times over. Elon Musk's wealth has quadrupled in the last 3 years, making him, as of course is well known now, the world's first dollar trillionaire. So this polarization has compounded a colossal rise in inequality. The USA has the grossest income inequality of all the G7 countries, as well as, by the way, the lowest life expectancy. It's the gross concentration of wealth that explains the nature of US politics today. In this grotesque nightmare society, every kind of monstrosity flourishes. Civilized life within the USA is rotting, resembling more and more the end days of the Roman Empire. To take just a couple of examples, over 48 million Americans have a drug or alcohol-related disorder. And listen to this figure, which absolutely astounded me. In the year 2025, there were 425 mass shootings. Mass shootings are defined as incidents in which at least 4 people were killed or wounded. Now, that works out as more than one mass shooting every single day. So these and other horrific symptoms are hallmarks of a terminally sick society. Troops have occupied American cities. Migrants are snatched off the streets. Hundreds of thousands deported. Around 2 million already driven by sheer terror to flee the country voluntarily. Hundreds of thousands of state employees have been furloughed or permanently sacked. The threadbare tissue of constitutional legality has been ripped open, a process foreshadowed in the 2021 Capitol riot, and now in the occupation of one city after another by the federal state terror army, ICE, with its free license to kidnap, incarcerate, and murder. The spectacle of ICE's thugs rampaging through one US city after another, randomly rounding up innocent victims, incarcerating them indefinitely in concentration camps on US soil and abroad, assaulting and sometimes murdering bystanders, that has invited comparison in some quarters with the fascist gangs of pre-war Europe. Now, how justified is this comparison? I just want to take a moment to make this point. Fascism means the physical destruction of the organizations of the organized working class. This entails the voluntary surrender by the ruling class of direct political power to a separate agency of hired mercenaries once traditional means of control have failed. Trump and his entourage certainly may have fascist ambitions. Musk's Sieg Heil salute at Trump's inauguration was certainly not an accident. And the fascist gangs they do have at their disposal, so far relatively small, do stand ready for deployment. The Proud Boys, the Oath Takers, the mob which stormed the Capitol, etc. But at this stage, they're held in reserve. Under classic fascist regimes, the capitalists and their traditional politicians surrendered political power to an unaccountable dictatorship as their best hope of preserving their property. Trumpism, on the contrary, represents the direct personal seizure of the functions of the state by a handful of capitalist oligarchs who have amassed into their hands such a vast accumulation of wealth and power that they feel able to dismiss the services of a professional elite to administer their affairs. The combined wealth of this, the richest cabinet in US history, comes to $7.5 billion. In other words, this is not a government for the rich, it's a government by the rich. Far from ceding sovereignty to an unaccountable gangster clique over which it has no immediate control, the Trump regime represents the direct administration of affairs by a capitalist class which has become so concentrated that it has dispensed with an entire culture of statecraft. The ruling corporations have amassed into their hands a grotesque accumulation of wealth and power, and they feel they no longer require a professional elite to administer their affairs. So, in other words, far from relinquishing direct power to a fascist dictatorship, they've even dispensed with the finesse, the diplomacy, the strategic planning of a classic bourgeois state. And that explains how it comes about that an already hopeless and terminal juncture for US imperialism has now been made catastrophically worse by the fickle, willful, capricious, impulsive blunders of Trump, as shown most graphically in the recent war or the current war with Iran, which is ending, as Matthew is going to show, in a humiliating defeat, both for the USA and for its local proxy, Israel. So how do we define this new phenomenon? I've suggested that it's time to retrieve the word plutocracy, which literally means rule by the rich. Now, of course, the rich have always ruled, but up to now they've entrusted the administration of their rule to a special caste of professional mandarins, politicians, and bureaucrats. And as I've explained, society today has become so grotesquely polarized, the wealth so monstrously concentrated, that the plutocracy feels able to dispense with any requirement to assign its collective interests to a specialized political agency. It now rules directly in its own name. Naked personal power is concentrated directly in the hands of the multi-billionaires, the venture capitalist Elon Musk, the shopping tycoon Bezos, the social media mogul Zuckerberg, all under the banner of the property speculator Trump. The ruling corporations have amassed into their hands this accumulation of wealth and power. Now, Trotsky commented that at its height, the British ruling class was able to plan for decades and even centuries ahead. By contrast, Trump has the strategic foresight of a flea. He switches policy literally several times a day. He's the personification of the dominant get-rich-quick class of parasitic property speculators, which has abandoned any long-term strategy in search of instant cash gains. And therein lies its imminent downfall. Now, finally, what about the working class? Now, in the 1930s, in the industrially developed countries, there was mass working class resistance, general strikes, political turmoil, even armed mobilizations. There were mass workers' party, rival mass internationals, millions of whose rank and file members were consciously striving for revolution. If it had not been for the fact that they were tragically and catastrophically and criminally split, the outcome could have been very different, the victory of the revolution throughout Europe. Today, we don't have such parties. There's a demobilization and a scattering of what was once a concentrated industrial proletariat. It was liquidated by calculated intent on the part of the ruling class. For instance, in Britain, Thatcher consciously and deliberately eradicated most of heavy industry precisely out of fear of the combativity and militancy of the industrial proletariat. And the consequence is that the working class today is still less prepared for the life and death struggles to come. So in this situation, why should we feel confident and optimistic? Because the working class today has not suffered the defeats of the 1930s. We're just at the beginning, not the end, of huge class struggles, as new generations of workers and youth are stung into action by the threat to their rights, their livelihoods, and their very survival. The decisive battles are still to come. The traditional mass workers' parties in all of Europe and in Russia, India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, etc., these were all born in an era of revolution from 1918, the 1920s, and the 1930s and beyond. And in some cases, they even held government office during an era when secondary concessions and reforms were grudgingly conceded by the ruling class. That is, in the post-war period, the 1950s, up to about the 1970s and 80s, and in some cases a little beyond. All these parties are now in a process of decay. They've nothing left to offer. And as we've seen, the brief and feeble spark of left demagoguery and verbiage we saw from the new left parties was extinguished as soon as the ruling class even began to show its teeth. But the world is still awash with protest and instability. There are asymmetrical phases of insurgency, hope, failure, despair, new upsurges. Every victory of the right provokes a new resistance on the part of the working class. Marx commented that the revolution sometimes needs the whip of counter-revolution. And we can see that happening in front of our eyes today. The war is not lost. The decisive battles are still to come. In the USA, for instance, there is a wave of protest and discontent. In Minneapolis, an entire city rose up to resist and chase out the armies of ICE. It was a virtual citywide insurrection. Then again, 8 million people demonstrated on the so-called No King's Day their rejection of Trumpism on the streets of cities and towns throughout the USA. In a National Gallup poll last year, 2/3 of people who classified themselves as Democrat supporters said that they had a favourable view of socialism. Then again, look at Asia today. A tsunami of youth revolts has been sweeping through Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Nepal, the Philippines. We've heard at our very own meetings first-hand reports from participants in every single one of these struggles. In India, in the last 4 years, we've seen the most massive manifestations of revolt actually in world history. The farmers' months-long physical siege of New Delhi, repeated 2-day general strikes of first 250 million and now 300 million workers. The crushing riposte of 20 million unemployed youth to the ignorant bigotry of the judge who compared their light to cockroaches. They responded overnight by founding what they called the Janitor Cockroach Party, thus proving our own foresight, I'm proud of this, that we in advance called the massive youth unemployment crisis in India a ticking time bomb. Now, the rage and the protest of the youth are amply justified, whether in Nepal or the USA, in Kenya or South America. They have no future under capitalism, no future either metaphorically or even literally. No worthwhile education, no jobs, no housing, no peace, no safety, no habitable planet. They're doomed. They will have no alternative conceivable option but to link arms and to find their natural allies within the working class. Now, I'm just going to finish on one last point. If at times we feel despondent at the task facing us, let's just for once look at life from the other side. Are the class enemy complacent about their future? The more perceptive of the world's super rich are absolutely terrified at the dangers ahead. They see the writing on the wall, the imminent threat of a social explosion. There is even a group which call themselves the Patriotic Millionaires, which conducted a poll showing that over 60% of the 3,900 millionaires that they had surveyed were concerned that extreme wealth was a threat to democracy, and two-thirds of them supported higher taxes on the super rich to invest in public services. And of course, predictably, their call was ignored. And I'd like to finish with one very significant quotation. Nearly 400 millionaires and billionaires from 24 countries signed an open letter to the recent World Economic Forum meeting at Davos. And this is I'll quote from their text. A handful of global oligarchs with extreme wealth have bought up our democracies, taken over our governments, gagged the freedom of our media, placed a stranglehold on technology and innovation, deepened poverty and social exclusion, and accelerated the breakdown of our planet. What we treasure, rich and poor alike, is being eaten away by those intent on growing the gulf between their vast power and everyone else. We all know this. When even millionaires like us recognize that extreme wealth has cost everyone else everything else, there can be no doubt that society is dangerously teetering off the edge of a precipice. Now, that's what the millionaires are saying. This is a crisis call. It's a desperate appeal. It reflects not a new spirit of charity or philanthropy on the part of the ruling class. It reflects their utter fear of revolution, and their fear is fully justified. And I would just end by saying that this should only strengthen our confidence and our determination to put an end to their rotting system. All right, thank you, Comrade.
Thanks, Roger.
Right, now, Matthew.
All right. Okay. No, I think you just to follow on from that. I think what's happening in the Middle East, the effectively it's the US Israeli assault on Iran, and also the rest, more or less the rest of the region as well, is a facet of this. I mean, in terms of the decay of the system. I mean, I think we have to understand capitalism as a system in decline, which is showing, rot, distinct elements of rot, has moved obviously towards to finance capital. Is and you can see all this stuff. And the interesting about when you talk about the fear of the effect, the effort. Having managed to stop a significant chunk of the world's production of oil and other important outputs, the capitalist powers bent heaven and earth. They used every reserve of oil they could find in order to keep the price down over the months, thus to try and prevent the actual response of the mass population, particularly obviously the working class. And I think. In those terms, the attack is a symptom of the decline of the US. Because obviously, while we can look at the British, of course, and the difference between the end of the British Empire and the rise of American hegemony, the difference now, of course, is that the system itself is in a much worse state. The system itself is really far more decayed. What we're also looking at is this strategy of the Americans, who understand obviously where they are in terms of the decline of their own economy and their position, and their effort to use essentially military power as a replacement for economic power in order to try and prop themselves up by use of force. This has failed. This is a clear indication of the failure of that effort. I mean, some people, I think there's some people in the Russian government have actually said, look, never mind, we're actually approaching World War III, we're actually in it. I think that's a sustainable argument. That we're actually in the period of World War III. Obviously, it's not a question of an outbreak of world warfare. Although, of course, the world has not been without war. I mean, capitalism is a system of war. We've not been without war since the Second World War. It has been it's been with us all times. Just obviously, in many cases, not hidden and not near the key points of power. What we're looking at really is also, of course, the inability of the US to then represent its own interests. Even, I mean, we're, under conditions, as Roger has said, where the Americans have disposed of their own, essentially the people around their own system. I mean, it's this sort of lunatic effort at the Führer principle. That everybody should obey Trump, which is why you get idiots like Hegseth, who's immediately in office in the US Department of Defense in order to obey Trump's orders and not ask any questions because he's not capable of them. And the effort also, of course, to impose upon even the US military itself, with its own history, impose Christian nationalism, reimpose racism, reimpose misogyny, and so on. All of this sit there systemically. So you have that. At the same time, obviously, this war is, of course, we can only see it as part of an assault on both Russia and China. And an effort to weaken both of those powers. That it has to be seen in that facet. What we're also seeing, of course, is the failure of all the systems within the region. I mean, obviously the systems of alliances of the US. And all of the countries in the Middle East are now thrown into chaos and into essentially put up in the air. I mean, we're looking at a situation where, with the end of this war, or what looks like at least an interregnum or a progression of the war, all of the countries in the Middle East are now essentially questioned. I mean, why the survival of all of the Gulf satrapies, the likes of Kuwait or Qatar or Bahrain or UAE, all of which, of course, were created by the British in order for their own interests, and then sustained by the Americans again for their own interests. And all these things are temporary. Or you can look at Iraq, again created by the imperialists, particularly the British, or Syria or Lebanon. All of these things are now up in the air, because none of it is solid, and none of it actually works. And in fact, of course, we're looking at a situation in which so many of those countries have been destroyed. I mean, literally, physically destroyed. Whether you look at Libya or Iraq or Syria, by the imperialists in deliberately in their effort to maintain their own power. So it has to be looked at in those terms as a regional question. I think then of course you come to the point that actually you're looking at a situation where the Israelis, who are the keystone, if you like, of imperialist power in the region, Israel is now in chaos. I mean, you have a situation where the military censorship was applied in order to prevent anybody from reporting the degree of damage that was done by the war, which is obviously much more severe than has been reported anywhere. Under conditions in which Israel has a situation where its army is essentially in a state of advanced disintegration. Its chief of staff is saying is missing tens of at least 12,000 soldiers or to carry out the minimal tasks in front of him. That there's an epidemic of PTSD in the country. That a country which actually was designed in order to fight only short wars has now been at war continuously for 3 years. this is unsustainable. Everybody knows this, and it cannot survive in those terms. If you look at the impact, and then the impact in terms of the genocide itself. Because obviously now you're looking at a situation where Israel, as that, isn't being defended. I mean, clearly defended by every single imperialist politician, in one way or another. Even the likes of the Spanish, effectively, who have made criticisms, and other bits and pieces who have made criticisms have actually fulfilled their duties in terms of supplying the Israelis, in terms of maintaining the Israeli military and the genocide. But under those conditions, all of that's tended to be exposed, but in front of the world's population. And what we have, of course, is this essentially barbarism and monstrosity been revealed to the world. And not only in terms of the people who run Israel, but also, of course, all of those people who prop it up. I mean, virtually all of our politicians, and of all stripes and varieties, have been exposed to the world as a bunch of bloodstained monsters. And also the question, it's a gross warning to the world that, of course, these are the methods of the imperialists. These are the methods of the genocide, are the methods of the imperialists. These are the things they're prepared to do. And they are, of course, in the old, the comparison, of course, is, can only be with the Nazis, and they're worse. They're actually worse. That's, obviously there are loads of lies and crap being passed around, but actually, of course, the methods applied are worse than those of the Wehrmacht and the SS. And the destruction. I think also the other thing I think we need to pay tribute to a number of people. In my case, I mean, the people I find who come out of this in the best way are actually the journalists of Gaza, who have, despite the fact the absolute effort and the genocide to liquidate them in the worst ways possible and kill their families, etc., etc. These people have exposed day by day to the world, live on social media, what has happened. And that's the first time that's been done. I mean, I think that, this is the impression it's made on the world, because it's in some senses, you can look at sort of previous wars like Iraq, where obviously horrible things were done, but you didn't have that. You didn't have, people actually be able to take cameras and pens and computers and social media into that and document exactly what these people were doing day by day in front of the world. That's extremely important, and I think that has driven the difference. I think you're also looking at, of course, is the failure of political tendencies. I mean, we've seen a gross failure of nationalism, of Arab nationalism, and you can go through it. You can go whether that's Syria or Iraq, the PLO or Lebanon or any of this stuff. All of that tendency has failed, and we're now left with this, some very, very strange things happening. We're seeing also, in terms of a grossly reactionary Iranian theocracy holding out against the imperialists, which is a real contradiction for him. And obviously, we would support resistance against imperialism, but clearly be deeply critical of the forces that are involved, and we should be critical of the forces, particularly in terms of the Iranian theocracy. And the thing is, of course, that none of these things actually have a solution. Whether that's the theocracy, which of course is desperate for a deal with imperialism. Would do a deal with it if the imperialists would possibly offer them a deal, that they could live with. They would take it in a heartbeat. This is the problem. They don't have a fundamental issue with the nature of the system. They just wish to be left alone to get on with exploiting and etc. their own working class. An issue which you could also say of the Russian oligarchs as well. The fact that the Americans and the Europeans in particular, of course, want to carve up Russia into bits of their own choosing is entirely the reason for the Ukraine war. I think also the other thing I think that's important, as I say, as I've alluded to, in terms of the war, is the solidarity movement, particularly against the genocide, which has mobilised billions of people. It's been the biggest solidarity movement in history. And some very important lessons have been learned. In some cases, I mean, we've seen entire countries. I mean, I don't know if people saw the huge demonstration in Dhaka in Bangladesh, which was counted at least 5 million. It was effectively everybody in the country who could get to Dhaka and march was there, which is essentially saying the entire country was against the genocide. And there are a number of other countries like this. And we've seen this, the whole thing run through the politics of numerous countries. What we haven't seen, unfortunately, with very small exceptions, is the working class, as an organised class, take a part in that. I mean, I think obviously the clear example is the Italians, because of the nature. I mean, the problem being, of course, what we sit here, it's actually sort of opened posed this whole question. What is the nature of the politics of workers' organisations, and who runs them, and the rest of it? Because obviously we've seen the trade unions, the bureaucracy of the trade unions throughout the world, essentially, form part of the entire, and nakedly and openly in many cases, form part of the control mechanisms for the imperialists, and assist in the manufacture and moving of weaponry to carry out the genocide. They stand guilty of that, and we can go through a number of the countries. But in Italy, of course, with the fractionation, obviously with the collapse of the PCI into neoliberalism in the 90s, and the fractionation of the Italian trade union movement, you have the rise of new unions like USB, which is essentially a syndicalist organisation. And they were able to organise, general strikes, political general strikes. So the first, not only just political general strikes, but political general strikes in support of another country. It's an exceptional thing. It's not something that has happened very commonly in history. That millions of workers come out on the street, say, we are marching in support of Gaza. We have stopped work in support of Gaza, or any some other country. That's extremely important in those terms. But we have not seen, as again, I think this is the thing. We have not seen the working class come on the stage in any serious and organised way across in global terms, or even, of course, in the Middle East itself, because all of these questions are now open and remain to be posed. Because and really it's also about in Middle Eastern terms, it's about what is the solution, and clearly it's not about countries, it's about the whole region. It's about the nature of the regimes in the region. It's about the power in the region, and it's not going to be solved by country. It's going to be solved regionally in those terms, and in political terms. What is the alternative to barbarism, essentially? And the fact that obviously, if you look at it, I mean, clearly, all of this is merged in together. I mean, I think it was most graphically illustrated by the demonstration in November 2023 in Egypt, where the regime under extreme pressure allowed a single demonstration in support of Gaza, in which the slogans raised obviously were in support of Gaza, but also straight into the slogans of the Arab Spring against the regime itself, because there's no real difference. There isn't any difference. All of these things merge in together, and we've seen this. You've even seen this in Syria, in demonstrations and so on in Syria and elsewhere, in those terms. So, I mean, I think it's really is to say that the Middle East war illustrates almost all aspects. It even goes down to the point of saying that the US is in such a state of decay, it can't manufacture its own weapons fast enough. It's actually ran out of weapons. One of the reasons they stopped was they ran out of weapons because they couldn't make them. They were firing off missiles. They were only making, in some cases, they were only making less than 100 missiles a year, and they started firing them off at hundreds a week. So in those terms, you can see, as I say, it's the decay of the system. So, yeah, thank you.
I'm not sure if Mahendra, are you there to chair the
Yes,
meeting?
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Who wants to speak? Just call in anybody who wants to speak. Put their hand up.
Yeah. I'm just looking at the hand who has raised the hand. Is anybody who first want to speak? Please go ahead. I don't see anybody hand raised up.
Okay, I'm gonna make some.
Do anybody want to? Yeah.
Thamos has his hand
Chanus,
up, and
yeah,
Steve.
please. Chanus and Steve. We want anybody first.
Well, first of all, I have to say that I consider this document we have in front of us one of the best perspective documents that I've seen for a long, long time. And I would agree with almost everything that is said. And I also liked very much Rogers and Matthew's introduction to the whole thing. And I would like to say a few words, especially about the comparison that Roger made between the 20s and 30s and today's situation, because I think it's a very important theoretical issue, and we have to see it as another turning point in the development of capitalism. I would say that the 20s and 30s were marked by the fact that competitive capitalism, as described by Marx, was by then finished. It had tried to do something else, and it was described by Lenin as imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And I think this is important to understand that it was the highest stage of capitalism in that sense, that it developed into monopoly capitalism, and the monopoly capitalism never left us. It stayed there, and it was in crisis in the way Lenin described it until the Second World War, which was the barbarism of there. And in that period, we had seen the same phenomena that we are seeing today. And what happened after the Second World War was in fact a managed capitalism. It was managed by the Bretton Woods agreements and American hegemony, which was accepted by everybody, especially in the face of fending off the danger from the Soviet Union. And in that sense, we saw a period of capitalist development that we've never seen before, which was exhausted by the 70s. First of all, due to its own internal developments, but also by the Vietnam War and the defeat of the Americans, which it was a blow to the American hegemony, and we should not underestimate that. It was very important in the same way that today's Iraq situation might prove to be for America again. And after that exhaustion, we saw the deregulation. We saw Thatcher and Reagan attack the working class and the working class organizations. They brought bringing in what they called neoliberalism, which was neither new nor liberal, in fact. But these gave tremendous power to people who were not gathering, who were not making profits by producing, but mainly by speculating and stealing from each other. this came to an inglorious end in 2008, and there we have another situation that's part of today's period of late capitalism, and this gave power to a handful of very rich people, and what very nicely was described by Roger, what that was happening. And we have to realize that the main differentiating situation in this thing is that while in early capitalism we had a few millions of capitalists ruling the world, and they had to have these state structures to run the system and keep the working class at bay, and at the same time be the referee between them. Now we don't have millions. We only have a few hundreds or a few thousands of people who rule the world through these riches and this power that they can buy and they can steal from everybody else. The rest of the capitalists are there, but they are just servants to these people, and they are losing power, and that's why they are realizing themselves that democracy is letting power slip off their hands as well. So we have to realize that it's not only the working class that is going to be that is going to have a problem with this, but huge numbers of capitalists that are being thrown and are being proletarianized, and are being disfranchised by this situation. And we have this phenomenon. And this is a very unstable situation. Wars are not an accident. Wars are being fought exactly because they have these conflicts between them. The American monopolies and the Russian monopolies, even China could be probably in a somewhat different way put into this part of the imperialist conflict that lies ahead. And we should not expect that there is going to end unless there is some sort of revolutionary change in some or a few countries, especially advanced countries. And this is not something that stands in a sort of looking for a new explanation. In fact, Marx defined this as, in the contribution to the critique of political economy, that no social order ever disappears before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have been developed. And new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the whole society. I think this have matured today, and it was noted by Lenin that when he said that we have seen that it's in its economic essence, imperialism is monopoly capitalism. This in itself determines its place in history, for monopoly that grows out of the soil of free competition, and precisely out of free competition is the transition form from the capitalist system to a higher socio-economic order. What Lenin is saying is that monopolies are not something bad. What is bad about monopolies is that they are in private hands. So today, the only thing that a revolution has to do is to take control of these monopolies, and then it can really rule the world. It doesn't have to take to nationalize every single capitalist around. They are going to be controlled if these monopolies pass in the hands of society. And this is not something easy. It's going to be fought, but it is a matter of politics, and it's not a matter of economics.
Andrew, we've got three people with
Thank
hands
you,
up.
Yeah, so I think that we have to look at this development of the attack on Iran as an expression of basically desperate situation of U.S. capitalism, U.S. imperialism. I mean, it's basically they're trying to do militarily what they can't do economically, and that is seize the oil of Iran, of the Middle East. That was the plan. So they would have control of that market. And it's completely backfired and exposed the weakness of U.S. imperialism and escalated the decline of U.S. imperialism. At the same time, I mean, I agree with people. There is a massive speculative bubble with massive amounts of capital going into data centers and speculation on AI, which is likely to lead to a collapse of the stock market and a situation worse than 2008 because of the massive deficit and the whole financial situation. I mean, if we look at the collapse in 2008, I mean, the United States was only able to, and the bankers, the capitalists, were only able to keep going by pumping trillions of dollars into the economy to prop up the banks and other industries. At this time, another collapse, that kind of pumping money in the economy is going to lead to hyperinflation in the United States and the world economy. So I think that we have to look at the inability of U.S. capitalism to compete with China, and is now basically supporting a trade war, which is further leading to the likelihood of a world economic depression with tariffs and trade wars, and also uniting the other capitalist countries against U.S. capitalism. So one of the things that I think is left out here is the development of fascism, because this economic crisis historically for capitalism in the post-war period in the 20s led to a rise of fascism. And what you have in the United States is not only a fascist government in our view, which wants to impose to crush the working class and use ICE thugs to terrorize the working class, terrorize immigrants, and are going to be used against workers as well. But also you have a billionaire class of Musk and Bezos and Peter Thiel and David Sachs and Larry Ellison, who are have a fascist ideology, and they're going to use their money, their billions, to support fascism around the world, not just in the United States. So you had the recent election in Colombia, where the United States was directly involved in manipulating the vote to bring in a fascist in power in Colombia. You had, of course, the military attack on Venezuela. And the support of these capitalists, fascist, techno-fascist, internationally, it can't be underestimated. They kept Malay in power, and they're supporting the AFD, and they're supporting fascist parties all over the world. That's a very important development for the working class, that these billionaire capitalists are actively supporting fascist parties globally. You have to take that very seriously. So I think that is a particularly important in relationship to what's going to happen in the United States now, because the desperation of Trump and his supporters that they will lose if there is an election, they'll lose it in the United States, is leading them to prepare for martial law in the United States. And in the structure of the United States capitalism, with the Congress, requires that the Vice President of the United States, Vance, and the head of the House, Johnson, actually carry out the transfer of power in the United States. One of the things Trump was doing in his attempted coup and insurrection was to prevent the certification of the vote so that Biden would not be elected. And he failed at that. The certification went forward. But if he hadn't failed at that, Trump would have stayed in power under the U.S. Constitution. That's the structure of American capitalist state. So what we face today is that they are preparing to intervene actively through state apparatus to attack balloting, to terrorize people from voting, and to prevent having any kind of even a facade of a democratic election. And in the face of that, and this is one of the things that we have to look at, is a complete paralysis of the trade union bureaucracy and social democracy. The idea that we're going to have an election of socialism, which is put forward by the DSA and Social Democrats, that it's going to be through election of socialists in Congress, or even that you'll have socialism in the United States, is complete naivete. The American capitalists are not going to allow socialism in the United States physically. They're going to stop it. They're already saying that Trump is already saying, and Johnson, that the socialists, that these DSA, who he calls communists, they're not really communists, are going to shut down the churches and they're going to kill people. They're going to terrorize people. Those are language to inflame the fascist supporters in the United States to start organizing to attack socialists and leftists and workers. There have been arrests of people, the Prairie Group in Texas, that were sentenced to 30 to 100 years on the basis that they were terrorists. They've changed through an executive order the rules that they can actually say that if you have socialist ideas, you can be a terrorist. And they had a book club, anarchist book club. So they're actually going far beyond the witch hunts in the 50s, where the FBI did go and try to terrorize people. They would go to the door, but they weren't wearing masks, and they didn't grab people without warrants. That is happening now in the United States. These fascist ICE thugs are basically, ignoring any kind of constitutional rights of the working class and of immigrants and people in the United States. So, in the face of this social and economic crisis, what's happening? Well, there's been an attack on Black representation. They are, changing the redistricting to exclude Black representation in the South. Going back, I mean, they want a segregated South in which Blacks are not allowed to have representation. This is a major attack on democratic rights, on the Black working class, and yet the unions, the AFL-CIO, none of the unions have called for any mass demonstrations or protest against this attack on the right of Black representation. So the reason they're afraid of mobilizing against this fascist government, they don't want to mobilize the working class. It is true that there was a protest in Minneapolis, but that didn't extend to other workers' centers, and the unions are not calling for any mobilization to prepare for further ICE raids. And there are going to be further ICE raids, mobilization that Trump is going to do. So I think that the question of fighting martial law, I think the question of fighting for Black representation and organizing nationally, calling on the unions and Black organizations to have a national protest against the right of Black representation would be a way of preparing and mobilizing. And I think that what we are fighting for, our committee, is for a general strike against any imposition of martial law, and to protect workers' rights in this upcoming period. The next several months is going to be very decisive in the United States. This year is going to be very decisive. And as I said earlier, Trump and the gangsters and fascists that control the state now are not going to go peacefully. And that's going to lead to very great confrontations. And unfortunately, the working class is unprepared politically. And social democrats are saying this victory of the DSA candidates means that that's the way forward to get people elected. We have to ask, are they going to allow an election? And that's a real question. As in our view, I don't believe that they're going to allow transfer of power to the Democrats, even though there's great anger at Trump and what he's doing, and the war and the trade war and the economic crisis the working class faces in the United States. So the question of a workers' party, the question of a general strike, that has to be fought for in the unions and in the working class against these attacks.
Aman is lifted up.
Sorry, did you say that?
Yes, Aman, you can carry on.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introductions, Roger, and obviously Matthew. Can you hear me?
Somebody needs to mute.
Okay. I had a couple of points which I thought probably I could emphasize on what was said. The situation, I think, today, I think, is quite interesting in many senses, and I'm sure many of us are familiar with what is going on in a variety of situations. But with regard to the work that was said earlier, it's interesting, the world of single polar by the rule of the US. We have been saying it, and I'm sure many of us have agreed that it's changing to a multipolar world. And similar to a multipolar to a single polar or unipolar was very much full of nuances and new situations. The reversal of it is also full of many changes and many alterations. There are many things which I think are new, and I'm not sure whether it is comparable to, in some senses, I understand what Roger was stressing on to, but I think it's very different from the 1920s. That was the time where we didn't have the situation of the collapse of Russia. The Russian Revolution, I think, from the capitalist point of view, was a hiccup on the way to globalization, which actually lasted until they managed to get a hold of a change and the market rule. We had the situation in the 1980s, if we all remember, that everybody was running away from what was called Marxism, and everybody was changing anything that had to do with communism, socialism, Marxism, and they were running away from it. Many parties started changing their names so that they wouldn't be associated with anything called in terms of Marxism. That era has passed. We entered with the 21st century into a different era. What I'm trying to get to is this point, and that is, irrespective of how we define that progress or that change or the impact of that change, if you look at the situation today, like, for example, the situation of the war in the Middle East from the point of view of the recent attack on during this year alone, 2 or 3 times attacks, and current war, which is going between US, Israel, and Iran, I just thought, if you think for a second, what would have happened if they had succeeded? We would have had another Syria, another Iraq in the Middle East. That didn't happen. That it did not happen because Islamic Republic had THAAD missiles. That did not happen because there was active participation against the war in, for example, in Iran alone. It wasn't the case that the Islamic Republic could muscle up millions of people in the streets. It was a great population who actually said, we don't want another Syria, we don't want to become another Iraq. There was a mass protest in Iran against that war, against the destruction and the future that was envisaged for what should happen in Iran. That was huge. Even the Islamic Republic now tries to say that that is because of them, because it's rallying on the flag, but that's not true. It was a huge number of people who actually stood up and said, we don't want this war to succeed the way it is planned, for Iran to become another Syria. That was huge polarization in the society. And that polarization meant the politics in the society became much more polarized from the point of view of assessing the opposition. Many of the parties who were climbing on the bandwagon and saying, oh, if the Islamic Republic goes, situation would be better. The devastation that they actually were envisaging, that there would be a way of them getting to power, that collapsed. And that was not just because of the Islamic Republic military power, that because the protest movement inside the country actually was against the war massive. And that huge rise had an impact. And I think what is important here is when we're thinking about this century, when we're thinking about currently, when we think about the situation, it means to what extent or how much would socialists, would different parties associated with the working class, they tend to actually put their foot and put their main emphasis on the separation and distinction of the working class, separation and distinct stance. That's hugely important. There is protest everywhere across Europe, obviously with the fall of, I think, Europe in the multipolar world in terms of its standing, insofar as Europe is concerned, and the burden of it and the Russophobia, which is actually hugely the basis at the moment, and the possibility of them even going in terms of the war with Russia is looming. And unless the working class, the stance of the working class, the distinct separation and its independent stance is there, situation of wars are going to continue. There is no other way. They're trying to work it out. They can't work it out politically. They can't work it out diplomatically. Military and might are the determining factors. And that puts huge pressure on the societies everywhere. The rise of the right wing, to a large extent, is the outcome of that. Without independent stance of the working class, in Iran, for example, we said against the war against the Islamic Republic. It's stand-up of the independence of that working class is our main goal. The extent that we can actually push forward that independence, to that extent, we can progress. At the moment, if there is no separate stance, with the demise and the failure of all of the ruling parties, irrespective of whether they're Social Democrat, Labour, Conservative, etc., across the whole place, the idea of that everything is going to change and everything, it doesn't matter who comes to power, the role of elections, the role of position of, or importance, or I think to a large extent, possibly illusion towards the possibility of through elections making changes is falling more and more. Less and less people will take part in elections. I think that would be the case in the US as well as many other countries across Europe. The unpopularity that exists. This is the room that is opening also avenues. And I think we've got to look at these avenues. That independent working class stance in terms of offering alternatives is the real way of actually fighting this back. This is whether we're looking at it globally or whether we look at it nationally. Importance or the task that I think falls on every socialist in every country to stand up against the bourgeoisie at this situation. The more that is not, as a poll, clear, the more the right wing would advance in terms of maintaining the status quo or whether by the use of the extreme fascists. We saw it in everywhere, and we have seen it across the Europe, and I think we're going to see it across USA. I thought it was irrespective of who is or what Mamdani defines himself as. He calls himself a socialist, which obviously isn't the case. But from the point of view of that, something like that occurring in USA, in New York, is huge. There is a massive change in US in terms of recognition or demonization of what is called socialist. It doesn't matter whether he is or he isn't. It's just a case that that's true. And the lack of, or I think the progression of the disillusionment about the possibility of Democrats possibly being able to hold off Trump. Biden did the same thing that Trump did and vice versa. One goes more extreme or the other. I'm not saying they're equal, but I'm saying insofar as the working class is concerned, the policies have resulted in the same thing for them. And anybody who says otherwise would seem to offer an alternative. In UK over the past decade, we have had, 7 prime ministers, and everybody's saying it's the same thing. It doesn't matter how much or what the rhetoric is. At the end of the day, it hasn't made any difference on the life of or living standard of the people. So as a result, anybody who says anything against them would take some sort of a advancement, whether you want to blame the foreign alien or whether you want to call it anything else. Anything that stands against them would have room for growth. And I think what we look for insofar as much of the youth and the youngers who are actually are looking and they don't have the heavy burden of the past, and they come up and they say, I cannot accept to live a life like this. And one thing which has been global has been the case that has happened across the world, from Lebanon right to, I think, Germany. Students are coming up from school, kids, pupils, are marching against compulsory army conscription. It's this youth, this growth, which is actually coming up and standing up, is one thing. And secondly, and I think that's what we got to look at, is how could the socialist working class express its independent stance against the system, against this current state, and for major change. And major change is not just political. Major change means having answers to the current situation and providing alternatives. And I think this is what we as socialists got to build on. And I think new horizons are opening. There is devastation as well. We are in a situation today that I think a lot of people are also saying the fact that what we used to have is no longer working. That's perfect ground for socialists to actually provide their alternative. And that is what we've got to build on. Thank you.
Thank you, Aman. Very good. You put light on the good points. Felicity or Jack? Anybody want first? You can.
You want to
Shall
go
I
ahead?
first?
You can go before me.
Okay, thanks. It's been a really interesting discussion, and particularly the last speaker, I thought, raised some very, very good points. That amazing things are happening. You know, there are good things happening despite everything. In terms of workers organisations, nothing at all like the level we need, but there are some some good points coming up. Just on the Iran issue, I mean, I've been glued to Al Jazeera throughout this war, and one of the very interesting things is the things where you see people walking around the streets in Tehran. Those girls look like girls anywhere. There's some of them with headscarves on, but they are not as oppressed as we're told they were. Anyhow, I want to raise a couple of issues. One is that in terms of just other perspectives, I know this is a starter document and it's a brilliant document, but we've got to look at the issue around the climate as well, because economics are there, politics is there, and all these threats to us, the political, economic, social crises that are there. There's also the crisis of the climate, and anyone who's lived in England the last few days has seen that, and certainly in Europe as well, where climate, the heat has been record breaking, and the society is not equipped for it. but it's not just the heat, is it? It's all the other things to do with what's going on in the climate. So we do have to take the climate into account. And my second point is that women are a majority of the population and a majority of the workforce. If you take the agriculture into account as well, and have not been shy at organising. They're also, and it was sad that Steve didn't raise it. The rise of fascism or proto-fascism in the States is seen on their approach to women, where they demand to control the bodies of women, to refuse abortions, even when not having an abortion will kill the mother. The whole setup of oppression of women is huge, and it's an essential part of the rise of reaction. But there's no doubt that women will respond to it. The other point I wanted to make was that we're almost in a stage where we've got to rethink how we do raising transitional demands. When we're organising and campaigning on issues, which once you would have been fairly simple to say, we demand this of the government. Like, I'm massively involved in the campaigns around the NHS. People are saying, but they're all the same. The governments are all the same. There has to be a stage beyond that, beyond making demands of the government, where we're actually making demands on the class itself, on the unions and on the communities to organise themselves. And it's a slightly different thing from earlier in my life. We have to do it differently, and it would be really good to talk about that with people to find out how we can do that. We need the transitional demands, and we don't have the socialist organisation that was there in the early part of the 20th century amongst the working class. We don't have the detailed street by street organisation that I grew up with, and certainly was there before that. But there is a thing of a much higher level of education, a much higher level of understanding of the situation. There are good points about it that can lead to workers' struggles happening quickly and without such a long drawback. And if workers don't come into struggle, well, frankly, we're having a chat like a book club. But I think there is every chance that workers will come into struggle, and in a big way. And just one sort of little point that came out of one of the comments someone else made, that the Die Linke in Germany came out of the Communist Party in the Ost, in the East. That was the Communist Party reshaping itself for the unification of Germany. And before the last general election, it looked like losing all of its seats. It had an appalling position on Palestine. It had an appalling position on the war with Russia. And one young woman stood up in Parliament and made a really good speech, and 60,000 youngsters joined Die Linke in the next couple of months, and has changed completely the character of that party. There's still, battles going on within the party between the old guard and the youngsters. But the youngsters reckon they've got a year, and then they'll take the party. And it's made a huge difference in Germany, and it's reflected in the demonstrations, as someone said, against Parliament, against Palestine, on the issue of Palestine. So I think it's a really interesting discussion. It's a good thing that we can look at all the different areas, looking at the climate and looking at women's issues as well. All of those things are really important, but it's actually quite important that we actually are. The talking today is probably, and talking other days is also a really important issue, so that we put our collective minds together and make this work. Thank you.
Okay, Jack. Thank you, Brother
Yeah.
City, for putting good light on your point. I like it. Please carry
Okay.
on.
So I agree with with what's been said about the the
वीडियो बंद है वीडियो
someone
बंद
needs
है ये देख
the
देख
galaxy
वीडियो बंद है वीडियो बंद है वीडियो बंद है ऑडियो तो अभी
someone needs to mute because this has come in before. It's Galaxy A365G. Okay, thank you. I agree with much of what's been said, and with the overall direction in Roger's document. But the direction is one thing, and the timing is another. It is not clear to me what the short-term crisis will be, as opposed to definite, intermediate, and long-term direction. So what I mean by that, for example, Steve and others have mentioned the financial bubble, and that's real. We've had huge bubbles in the past, and they've wriggled out of them in various ways. Back in the mid 1970s, I was convinced the majority of bourgeois economists were convinced, that there was no way out for the system. That there was going to be a wide scale economic collapse, possibly a world depression, and then you had the Volcker round and and launching neoliberalism with structural adjustment, and you had you had shifting bubbles in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and this could happen again with the AI bubble. It's not necessarily going to be a complete stock market collapse immediately. I don't see a long-term way out, but they may wriggle out and defer. We're going to find out in the U.S. within the next 6 months just how serious the threat of real right-wing tyranny is going to be, because we will see what happens in the elections. It's clear that Trump and his supporters are going to try to disenfranchise voters, and they will attempt to reverse whatever elections there are. But there's overwhelming sentiment in the U.S., not everywhere geographically, but overall, against the Trump and the Republicans. Now they will lose control of the legislative branch if there's anything resembling a fair election. If they, but they're liable to campaign to overturn it. But I think we need to look not just at their strength, their power, but we need to look at the divisions inside of the MAGA and Trump supporters, and we need to look at the fragility of Trump's position, not just the strength. So MAGA has always, we've known, I've spoken on this here before, real fault lines. It's not a homogeneous movement. You have real fascists like Stephen Miller. You have, and Elon Musk may be one. You have various other members of that coalition. Right now, Trump has lost considerable support among young white men, in particular, because of the affordability crisis. And that's not going away. He's making it worse. Trump in Iran, we can see the weakness there. did not have to launch that war, but that's who he is. Basically, the Iranians have him over a barrel now. The U.S. is unable, with just an air war alone, even with the Israelis, to control the Straits of Hormuz and to destroy the ability of Iran, to respond with missiles and drones. And Trump would desperately want to get out, but again, his coalition is not homogeneous. So right-wing hawks in Congress, in the Senate and House, reacted against the attempt to have the ceasefire deal. His memorandum of understanding, or whatever it was really a table of contents. It wasn't, there was nothing in it except pointing to what they hoped could be settled. But even that was too much, and the potential concessions to Iran, which he had to make because the Iranians hold the upper hand, but it's too much for the neocons and the hawks. And by the way, many of those, some of them are Democrats, like Hillary Clinton, who is, as far out there as anyone. So Trump would like to get out. The Israelis, Netanyahu, and behind him, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and so on, have another idea. They want to destroy Iran. They want to turn it into the rubble, that's been done to Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and so on. They want to destroy that, and they want dominance. They want to recreate Eretz Yisrael, to take over large parts of Lebanon, Jordan, and so on, to expel the Palestinians from the West Bank and from Gaza. So you have real divisions there, and I don't, so Trump is in a position of fragility, but there is no real mass organized alternative in the U.S., and without that alternative, they may very well succeed, in continuing to run roughshod. We have seen, some signs of a resistance that can overcome that. There was what happened in Minneapolis. Steve is right in terms of, pointing out its limits, but nevertheless, that was a major occurrence and could be replicated. Mamdani is, barely even he's basically has the program of FDR, a New Deal, and a moderate version of it. But nevertheless, you now have someone who is identified as a socialist, as has been pointed out by previous speaker, gaining support. And it's not just in New York City. There are other places, Portland, Oregon, Chicago, and elsewhere, where you're having this social democratic current gaining strength, electorally at least. The Labor Notes Conference, speaking of social democrat, left social democratic tendencies, had 4,700 or so labor militants and staffers at their most recent conference. That is more than double what they had only a few years ago. The 4,700 includes many, many militants who are looking for some way to respond, some organized way. Labor Notes is not going to be building the kind of fighting alternative that's necessary, but that's an indication of a real, not just a potential base, but people looking to fight back and organizing. Many of them were attempting to at the shop floor and local basis. So you have, you have the the potential that you can point to for building on, and I think that's important, and it provides some hope. I don't and I don't. So again, I think we will see within the next 6 months. The elections are now barely just over 4 months away, as to the outcome there. It's not that I think that the Democrats are a great hope, but I think that it is possible that you will have, the basically eradication of much of what's left of bourgeois democracy if they're able to, if Trump and his gang are able to just impose their victory in the elections, and we know that that's the whole direction that he's been going in, declaring that the 2020 elections were rigged and he really won, and so on and so forth. But I think that they're going to have a real problem doing it. I think that his coalition is fragile, and unfortunately, we don't have the alternative that's needed to drive through it. But as I said, I think we can see the seeds that are there in terms of, I mentioned the size of the labor notes turnout, but there's also the divisions inside his group. He's losing support among what had been the core of his base, young white men, and because of his clear inability to provide what he said he would on affordability, and more than that, his obvious indifference to it, and the kind of remarks that he makes in public all the time, saying he doesn't really care about it. Anyway, so my main point is that I think that we need to understand that the situation posed by Roger and others is real, but that there are that we need to look at the other side also. We need to analyze the weakness of the position of the other side, not just look at its at the dangers. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Jack. Very good point you put, sharing thoughts. Karen, you can carry on, please.
Thank you, everybody, for your comments and for the intros from Roger and Matthew. I'll be very quick. I just wanted to make some, as we're running out of time.
Sorry, we have Galaxy. You need to mute yourself. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to make some points sort of across the board of this discussion. This has been a wonderful discussion. I think that we cannot underestimate what I think of really as a seizure of our rights in the US. Changing of definitions, changing of laws, so that as to undermine any kind of solidarity or organization. The cases that recently came down, the decisions in Texas with people being given absolutely outrageous sentences for doing almost nothing. There was a case here in Spokane also with 3 people who were charged with conspiracy. They didn't really even know each other. They were in the same place at the same time. So changing that definition and making that widespread, I think that we can't underestimate the danger of that to organization in the country. Going to another issue, on the issue of the genocide and the whole Middle East situation, I think Matthew brought up many points that this situation showed weaknesses of and whatever. But I think that another thing is that it also shows our failure of our international organizations. Whether that failure is institutional or simply by acquiescence, that a failure to act, I think that those institutions are poor. I mean, they are weak, at least in their ability to act. I think that with regard to organizing in the US, and I don't know about this issue globally, but in the US, I think that one bright point is the data centers. And I think that that the backlash against the data centers has been very widespread. And I think that's been widespread not only nationally, but it has been widespread socially. I think that the young white males who have become disillusioned with Trump, and Trump is really trying to pull them back with religion and all of these testosterone-laden events. But I think that the data centers actually have promise of perhaps creating an issue that goes beyond many of the divisions that we have. That said, I'll go to something that that Felicity said, is that I don't think that there is, even with the data centers, I don't know that there is really any clarity of demands. What do they want? They want no data centers, but that really isn't a demand or even an organizing principle. But anyway, I do think that is a high point. I also agree with Felicity that we do need to discuss climate and also the gendered perspective of world events. And one last thing, and I know we can't get to this today, but I thought it was a very interesting comment by Matthew in his introduction about the failure of political tendencies, if I understood that correctly. And I would love to hear more about that sometime in the future. So I'll stop there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Karen, for good points. Harry, can you please carry on?
Sorry,
Yes,
was
Harry,
I?
you can go, please.
Hi, comrades.
Yes.
I lost my internet there. I've missed a good part of the meeting. I'm just actually catching up with the discussion here. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I'm having a lot of trouble with my internet here. Harry from Ireland here. Okay, I'll try to make points as quickly as possible here. You know, there's two global, if you want, tsunamis, if you want, coming together in the world today. One of them, of course, is the BRICS countries. You know, there are 11 BRICS countries throughout the world that is massively expanding against the G7. Now, BRICS globally has about 34% of the global GDP compared with the G7 at around 26, 27%. And for the West, they're in no position to compete with the BRICS countries. The production, particularly in the new AI stuff that's coming in, it's effectively China and the East that are massively outgrowing. So for the West, economically, they're not going to compete with BRICS. And I think we're seeing a domino effect of many other countries that at least is probably going to adhere towards moving towards BRICS. Probably Australia. There's countries like Saudi Arabia, which actually is part of BRICS. I'm not sure if they've actually formally joined, but countries like that throughout the world are moving towards BRICS. And, you know, when you look within Europe itself, you find that with all the sanctions and so on that has been put on the East, they can't ignore China and their production capacity. Even countries like Spain, Italy, they've signed contracts with countries like Russia and China. They can't ignore BRICS, is the biggest problem. Now, there's only one way out for the West in America and the European countries through NATO, and that is war. There's no other way out for them. And they're moving towards now developing that war machine. In the European Union, there is a massive, at least planned, massive expansion in their weaponry, probably aiming for around 2034, 2035 to be in a position to go to war, certainly against Russia. And in America, we're seeing exactly the same thing, albeit more to do with China. The big question is can the European countries, and indeed America, can they achieve this armaments build-up effectively in the next, perhaps less than a decade, probably more than, in the next number of years? When you look at the economies in Europe, I mean, Germany's effectively in its fourth year of recession, but yet it's planning on a massive military expansion within that massive military. I mean, they've already spent about $250 billion. They aim to double that in the next number of years in their military expansion. And it's certainly going to be the biggest country earmarked in the European sense of NATO in developing a war machine against Russia, but other countries as well. And no more so than Britain. Stammer resigned a week ago, and I think many people don't understand why. Stammer is the most unpopular prime minister since records began, but that's not why he resigned. He resigned because he was not in a position to deliver for the corporations in moving Britain towards that war machine from Britain's own capacity. He wasn't able to do that. He was doing U-turns, fight back from the working class against a number of measures that they were coming in, national insurance, taxes, tax on the disabled was all U-turned round because of mass protests taking place in the street. And the reason that he resigned was because he was not able to deliver for the corporations and to development of the war machine. Burnham, who's now Prime Minister designate, has already made it clear that he is going to attack the working class. He makes no bones about it. He will have to take it. It'll be the working class will pay for the war machine that's coming in. And, there's other people that haven't exactly thrown their hat into the ring. There's a man called Al Carnes, who's a former Royal Marine. He's possibly may throw his hat. I doubt if he will actually, but that's not the point. He's making a very astute point at the moment. A new incoming government under the Burnham must deliver and develop the war machine in Britain. So this is what they're faced with. I think consciously throughout the country, people are quite aware of the strategy of moving towards war. You hear it all the time in protests. Protests for the disabled, no cuts and benefits, no to the war. And it's consciously, I think, very aware of where the governments want to bring this country towards. And the big question is, will the fight back from the working class, or will the economies in Europe prevent them from developing this war machine that they plan to do in the next number of years? I think we're seeing exactly the same thing in America. They've extended their military budget by another $500 billion. At the moment, the Trump regime seems to be doing nothing more than printing money. Everything that they're doing, another $85 billion. They've asked Congress to rubber stamp in the war against Iran, even though there's supposed to be a peace process on the way of going there. And America is simply printing money at the moment to develop this war machine. The big question is will the corporations actually step in now? In the 1930s in Germany, it was corporations that actually stepped in to really develop the war machine for Nazi Germany that led to the war. Will the corporations? And that's going to be the fundamental question. Can the West develop this war machine against Russia and China? I think we're going to see the limitations to the war, and we're seeing it now in the Middle East. America in this war against Iran shows how they're actually stalwart in really taking even a country in the Middle East on, because they're not winning it. Iran's winning this war in the Middle East. America is running out of weapons, and all Iran has to do is to effectively hold course, sit there and survive. The whole picture of the Middle East is now fundamentally changing. Iran is the dominant country now in the Middle East. Israel is a country that now cannot depend on America to back them up as the bulwark against the other countries. They're looking towards the UAE, and the UAE withdrew from what do you call it, the oil agreement between the other countries, only there to produce as much oil as possible and effectively finance Israel in the Middle East. That whole picture in the Middle East is completely fundamentally changing as we see it. And I think at the end of the day, our big question is, can Israel survive? Can America's influence in the Middle East continue? And I think the vision is that it probably cannot. It was there to support Saudi Arabia, the UAE, all the other countries. We'll do you favors on the one condition: you protect us. They have failed to protect those countries. So the whole Middle Eastern picture is unfolding in a completely, and can America's influence continue in that country? It's just to finish on this point, because we see the rise of fascism, and we see it in Europe. And I think for the corporations, it's not exactly the biggest issue about who becomes the fascistic government. If you're fascistly orientated, we have in this country Reform, Nigel Farage, and people like that there. It's not a big question of who is going to be the fascist country. Germany, the AfD may well take over there. Other countries throughout Europe are moving towards the fascists. So they're moving towards fascism in order to deliver on this war machine that Europe has needed. And of course, we've seen it in Trump in the 21 coup attempt taking over in that country. So that isn't. We're fighting back against the rise of fascism and against the war machine. And at this particular time, I mean, I'm not sure it's necessarily that the thing we need right now is a mass party of the working class. The attempt that we tried under Corbyn, your party, which has fundamentally failed, that isn't, I believe, necessarily what we need. We need a party that's going to go out there on our platforms and raise the ideals of socialism in the ears of the working class. We have to raise socialism. And I think it was previously mentioned there that we have to offer a way out, a vision, a socialist vision for the working class. It's not necessarily, in my opinion, that we build a party and people are going to come and join us, but it is our duty to be out there delivering on that vision of socialism in every area that we can. Platforms, anti-racist platforms, disabled, fighting for disabled rights, every area, because I think the mistake we're making, we condemn the opposition, we condemn the fascists, we become anti-fascist movements. That's not going to win us the day. What's going to win us the day is to tap into the struggle of the working class where we are today and put forward those ideals of socialism in every way, in the consciousness. And it will be the seismic events that move forward that consciousness of socialism is in the consciousness of the working class. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry, for inside information. It's eye-opening. Anybody want to give some? I don't see any hand raised. Please, anybody want to speak?
I suggest we close the discussion for today with brief replies from Matthew and myself, if that's okay with everybody. Is Matthew here?
Yeah, Matthew, please go on.
Okay, if Matthew's
He's
not here,
not
I'll just make a I'll just make a final point. I've not got a reply at length. I think it's been an absolutely brilliant discussion, one of the best we've had. And it's really good to see, the comments have come in, all made really constructive and useful points and filled in a lot of the gaps that were left out, perhaps in the document and in my lead off. I'm only going to make one or 2 points. I also think it's very good to see that there were comrades here from 9 countries. We need. Okay. Sorry. Is everybody? Can you hear me, everybody? Yep. Okay. All right. No, just very, very quickly. I think the main thing to say is that this is not the end of a discussion. This is only the beginning. We did not intend that a conference would simply be to present a document, to make a lead off, and let people talk about it, and then say, right, shut the book, and that's it. This is only the beginning of a process, and we are encouraging comrades to submit amendments, addenda, to add their points in. I think most of the points the comrades made in the discussion were really valid and very useful and very necessary addenda to the documents and to the points that I tried to outline in the lead off and Matthew. So look, I would really appreciate if comrades would submit in writing some of the points that they think are needed in order to amplify and in order to perfect the position. That's what a conference is for, to clarify our ideas, to learn from one another. I do think, first of all, I hope that comrades did not misunderstand my point to think that I was dismissive of the threat of fascism. On the contrary, it's the reason why I began with the comparison with the 1920s and 1930s, although I agree, of course, with Aman that there are many major and decisive differences with that period. But the reason I did is because I think we need to guard ourselves against complacency and against the idea that defeat is not an option or not a likely option even. If you ask whether I'm optimistic about the situation, well, of course, none of us can say that. What we do need to say is that the decisive battles have not been waged so far. We're still gearing up. We see the threats. We see how the enemy is mobilizing. We saw in Britain something we haven't seen since the 1930s. We've seen demonstrations of some 150,000 racist thugs on the streets, led by the so-called Tommy Robinson. And we see the financing of an outright and open, overt racist fascist party called Restore UK. And they are financed by Elon Musk. Now, Elon Musk is a trillionaire. He can give them $100 million without even noticing it. It would just be small change from his pocket. There is a huge and serious and deadly threat. And I agree also with Steve. It's not at all right to. It would not be at all right to dismiss the threat of that we see of fascism, outright fascism in the USA too. But the question is that the battle has not been joined. The question is that we're not at the end of a struggle, we're at the beginning of a struggle. The whip of counter-revolution, as I quoted from Marx before, that is going to have an effect. Jack talked about the I think it was Jack, talked about the disillusion of the youth, the white youth, against Trumpism because of the rise of unemployment, the rising cost of living, etc. I mean, that is the point. Really the reaction is still to be seen. And we're seeing that all over. We're seeing it also in even in Europe, but certainly in Asia and certainly in America, and also we've seen the youth revolts in many parts of Africa, in Kenya, for instance, too. So that's the first thing. We need more on that, but I think the point is that we're not defeatist. The point is that there is a whole era of struggle and revolution and counter-revolution that we're going through. The end is by no means guaranteed. There is no reason for complacency. There's also no reason for defeatism or fatalism either. I agree with Felicity that we need more on the climate. We need more on the gender discrimination. We need to emphasise actually the leading role of women in the struggles of the working class and within the working class as a whole at the present time. All of that needs to be added to our documents. By the way, I have to point out that the document that we're discussing today is not the only document that is under discussion. We'll be discussing next week. Finn is going to be leading off on his document on the trade unions. In a couple of weeks, we'll be discussing how the international will be built. And also, we are once again returning to a project that we started some years ago. We're bringing it to a completion now of a manifesto of WIN, and that will, of course, cover a lot of the issues that maybe are still been not sufficiently addressed in our documents up until now. I'd just leave it at that. But the main thing I want to finish with is a point that I made in many discussions we've had in Britain about the question of building of a new mass working class party, that there is a vacuum, and as the scientists said in 2, 3, or 4 centuries ago, that nature abhors a vacuum, politics abhors a vacuum. The fact is that there is a yawning vacuum. We see, as I say, in America, we see the millions of people on the streets in the No Trumps rallies. We see the rising of the Minneapolis population to drive out ICE. We see the various signs electorally have moved to the left. We see those opinion polls where an astonishing percentage of people have identified themselves as socialists. They may not know what socialism means, but the fact is that decades of slander and filth against the whole concept of socialism have made no impact in terms of the survival of some inchoate aspiration towards a new society, and that's what we base ourselves upon. So look, we'll have much more discussion on all these issues. As I say, it's not the end of the discussion. We do invite comrades to submit, not only in speech but in writing too, any amendments or addenda that they want to put to the documents, and also to participate in our future sessions of our conference. Thank you to everybody for their participation. I think it's been a really uplifting and inspiring discussion. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Roger. Points you have spoken. Please, yeah, please carry on. Yep.
Okay, bye, comrades.